My name is Eleanor Whitcomb, and 3 days before my 63rd birthday, I sat in my son's guest bedroom, the one they called Mom's Suite, and I listened through a wall that was never as thick as they thought it was, while my daughter-in-law told my son that the sooner I signed the papers, the sooner they could finally stop pretending to care. I had given that woman my husband's watch. I had given that man my whole life, and in that moment, sitting on the edge of a bed in a house I helped pay for, I made a decision that would change everything, not just for me, but for every single person who thought I was too old, too tired, and too trusting to fight back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming amazing videos. I was born in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, in a house with a wraparound porch and a mother who believed that a woman's worth was measured by how much of herself she could give away before there was nothing left. I used to think she was wrong about that. For most of my life, I built my whole identity trying to prove her wrong. I became a teacher because I wanted to matter to people who weren't blood. And I married a good man named Walter Whitcomb because he made me laugh on our second date so hard that I spilled coffee on his one good tie, and he never once complained about it. We had 2 children together, a son named Gregory and a daughter named Patricia, though everyone called her Patty from the time she was small enough to fit in the crook of my arm. I taught 4th grade for 31 years at the same elementary school 2 blocks from our home. I baked bread every Sunday, the whole house filling with the smell of it by 9 in the morning, and I kept a garden that my neighbors used to stop and admire on their evening walks, tomatoes and roses growing side by side, because I never could decide whether I wanted the yard to feed us or simply to be beautiful, so in the end, I let it do both. I thought for most of my life that I understood exactly what my life was for. Walter and I built that life slowly and carefully, the way people used to before everything became so fast. He worked as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant on the edge of town, came home every evening at exactly 5:15, and the first thing he did, without fail, for 39 years, was find me wherever I was in the house and kiss me on the forehead before he even took off his coat. Our children grew up in that rhythm. Gregory was the kind of boy who read the financial section of the newspaper before he was old enough to drive, who kept a ledger of his allowance in a little spiral notebook, who once told me at the age of 9 that he intended to be a millionaire by 30 because he had done the math on compound interest and it seemed, to him, like the only sensible plan. I remember laughing so hard I had to sit down. Patty was different from the start, softer in some ways and fiercer in others, the kind of girl who cried when a bird flew into our window, but who would also march up to the older boys at the bus stop if they were being unkind to a smaller child. I loved my children in different shapes, the way every mother does, though I understand now, with the clarity that only comes from looking backward, that different shapes of love can feel, to a child, like different amounts of it. Walter passed 3 years before the events I am about to describe. It was his heart, sudden and quiet, the kind of ending that leaves you standing in your own kitchen, wondering how a person can be there one morning, kissing you on the forehead before he heads out to the hardware store for a bag of grass seed, and simply not exist by that evening. He had complained of nothing, not a single ache, not a moment of shortness of breath. The doctor later told me it was the sort of thing that sometimes happens without warning, a blockage no one could have predicted, and that I should not spend the rest of my life searching for a sign I could have caught, because there was no sign to catch. I have tried, in the years since, to believe him. Some nights I believe him more than others. I will not spend too long describing that grief, because grief is its own long story, and this one is about what came after. But I will tell you that Walter's death cracked something open in me that I did not fully understand at the time. It made me realize how much of my identity had been built around being needed by other people, first as a daughter, then as a wife, then as a mother, and finally as a teacher, and how frightening it is to sit alone in a house built for 2, in a kitchen that still had his coffee mug in the same cabinet, his reading glasses still folded on the nightstand where he'd left them the last morning of his life. I kept his side of the closet exactly as it was for almost a year. I could not bring myself to give away a single flannel shirt. It was into that particular kind of loneliness, the kind that makes a person eager for any hand reaching toward them, that my son Gregory walked one Sunday afternoon, roughly 18 months after Walter's funeral. My son had always been the golden child, though I hate using a phrase like that about my own boy, because it suggests I loved him more, and I don't believe that's true, even now. What is true is that Gregory's ambitions had always been easier for me to understand and easier for me to speak the language of, because they mirrored my own mother's belief that success was something you could point to, measure, hold up as proof of a life well lived. He went into finance after college, married a woman named Vanessa 2 years later, and moved into a large house in a development about 40 minutes from where I'd raised my children, the kind of neighborhood with matching mailboxes and a homeowners association that fined you for the wrong shade of holiday lights strung along your gutters. Vanessa was polished in a way that always made me feel slightly underdressed in my own family, even at Thanksgiving, even in my own daughter-in-law's kitchen. She had a way of complimenting you that somehow left you feeling smaller than before she opened her mouth, a talent I did not fully appreciate the danger of until much later. I told myself for years that this was simply her manner, that some people express warmth through control, through organizing, through deciding things for you before you'd had the chance to decide them for yourself. Why, I told myself a great many things over the years that, looking back, I told myself because the alternative was too painful to sit with. My daughter Patty was different from her brother in almost every way that mattered. She had married a kind, quiet man named Daniel Reyes, a man who fixed things with his hands and rarely raised his voice, and the two of them lived a more modest life in a rented duplex 2 towns over, raising a son named Mason who had Walter's exact laugh, the same 3-note chuckle that used to make me cry a little when I heard it, because it felt like my husband hadn't entirely left us. Patty and I had a complicated relationship for years, the kind that mothers and daughters sometimes have, full of old wounds neither of us quite knew how to name out loud. She felt, for most of her adult life, that I had favored Gregory, that his ambitions had always mattered more to me than her steadiness, that I praised his promotions louder than I ever praised her patience with her son's asthma or her quiet, unglamorous work as a hospital billing coordinator. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing I have left to offer at this point in my life. She was not entirely wrong. I did not see it at the time. I see it now, and I carry it. Gregory came to me on a Sunday afternoon, sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd once helped him with algebra homework and helped Patty with her science fair volcano, and told me, with tears actually forming in his eyes, that he couldn't stand the thought of me alone in that big house, that he and Vanessa had already talked it over, and that they wanted to build me a proper suite attached to their home, a place where I could have my independence but never be more than a hallway away from family if something happened to me in the night. He talked about how they'd looked into contractors already, how Vanessa had even picked out paint colors she thought I'd like, a soft sage green because she remembered I'd once mentioned liking the color of new spring leaves. I remember exactly how that felt. It felt like being loved in a way I had almost forgotten was possible after losing Walter. It felt like someone had noticed the exact shape of my loneliness and built something to fit it. I cried at that kitchen table. I told him yes before I'd even finished my coffee. I want you to understand something before I continue, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who has ever made a decision out of loneliness. Loneliness makes you generous in ways that clear thinking would never allow. It makes you eager to believe the best interpretation of every gesture, because the alternative, that someone you raised might be capable of using your grief against you, is simply too unbearable to consider. So I sold the house Walter and I had built our whole life inside of. I stood in the driveway the day the movers came and watched strangers carry out our dining room table, the one Walter had built himself in our garage the summer before Gregory was born, and I told myself it was just a table, that the memories lived in me and not in the wood, though I am not certain, even now, that this was entirely true. I sold most of the furniture, keeping only what would fit in a single guest suite. I signed the proceeds of that sale, nearly $400,000, the accumulation of 39 years of two careful, hardworking people, into a joint account that Gregory told me would make things easier, in case anything ever happened to me, in case I ever needed care that required someone to act quickly on my behalf. Vanessa sat beside him the whole time at the bank, nodding, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, telling the young loan officer how relieved she was that I would finally be safe, how families should take care of their own instead of leaving it to strangers in facilities. I remember the loan officer smiling at her, clearly moved. I was moved too. I had no idea, sitting in that bank, that I was watching the opening scene of something far less tender than it appeared. For the first several months, it truly did feel like a gift. I had my own little suite, a bedroom, a small sitting room, a bathroom with grab bars Gregory had installed himself, a door that led out to the backyard so I could sit with my coffee and watch my granddaughter Sophie play in the mornings before school. Sophie was 10 years old at the time, a bright, curious girl with her father's sharp mind and, thankfully, none of his impatience. The kind of child who used to climb into my lap even though she was almost too big for it, and ask me to tell her stories about what her father was like as a little boy. I told her about the time Gregory tried to sell lemonade to the mailman at triple the going rate, and was baffled when the poor man declined. I told her about the summer he insisted on doing all his own laundry to prove he could, and turned every white shirt in the house a faint shade of pink because he'd washed them with one of my red dish towels. Sophie would laugh so hard she'd nearly fall off my lap, and I remember thinking, in those mornings, that perhaps this arrangement really was the blessing it had been sold to me as. Those mornings were, I think, some of the last truly happy mornings of that entire year, and I did not know it at the time, which I suppose is the way it always is with happy mornings. You rarely know which ones are the last of their kind until long after they've passed. The changes came slowly, the way water erodes stone, so gradually that you don't notice the shape of things has changed until you step back and realize the riverbed looks nothing like it once did. It started with small comments from Vanessa about how tired I seemed, how forgetful I'd become, how she'd noticed me repeating myself at dinner or misplacing my reading glasses. I want to be fair here. Everyone forgets things. Everyone repeats a story now and then, especially a woman in her 60s who has just lost her husband and sold the only home she has known for 4 decades. But Vanessa had a particular way of saying these things in front of Gregory, in front of guests, in a tone soft enough to sound concerned but pointed enough that I began to feel a low hum of anxiety every time I opened my mouth at that dinner table, wondering if whatever I said next would be added to some invisible ledger of evidence. She began, too, in ways I did not clock at the time, to quietly discourage certain visitors. My oldest friend, a woman named Barbara Coyle, whom I had known since we were both 22 years old and newly married, living 2 doors apart in our first apartments, called the house one afternoon to arrange a lunch date, and I later learned, though not until much later, that Vanessa had answered and told her I was resting, that I had seemed overwhelmed lately, and that perhaps it would be gentler on me if visits were spaced out more, arranged through her rather than dropped in on directly. Barbara, being the kind of friend who does not push where she isn't wanted, respected that boundary for months, believing she was being considerate, when in fact she was simply being managed out of my life, one polite phone call at a time. Then came the visits to what Vanessa called just a routine checkup with a doctor I had never chosen and had never heard of before that spring, a specialist 2 counties over rather than my own longtime physician of 20 years. I went along with it because Gregory asked me to, because he held my hand in the waiting room and told me it would put everyone's mind at ease, that it was simply good practice at my age to have a baseline established. I remember the waiting room had those uncomfortable vinyl chairs and old magazines with the address labels torn off, and I remember thinking, sitting there, how strange it was that a stranger's opinion of my mind had suddenly become important enough to warrant an appointment none of my own doctors had recommended. The doctor asked me to remember 3 words, an apple, a table, and a penny, and repeat them 5 minutes later. He asked me to draw a clock face and mark the hands at 10 past 11. He asked me what year it was, and who the president was, and where I currently lived. I answered every question correctly, and I remember feeling almost proud of myself, the way you feel proud after passing an exam you didn't realize you were being tested on. I did not think, at the time, to ask why my son and his wife needed a stranger to confirm what I already knew to be true. that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I did not think to ask for a copy of the report. That, I would later learn, was a mistake that nearly cost me everything. It was Patty who first planted the seed of doubt in me, though at the time I resented her for it, which I deeply regret now. She had come to visit one Saturday, bringing Mason along to play with his cousin Sophie in the backyard, and she found me alone in my little sitting room folding laundry, a small radio playing an old Nat King Cole record Walter used to love. She sat down across from me on the edge of the daybed and asked, very carefully, whether I had signed anything since moving in. I told her about the joint account, about how sensible it seemed, about how relieved I'd been that someone finally wanted to take care of me the way I had spent my whole life taking care of everyone else. Patty's face did something I will never forget. It went pale, then careful, then very still, the way a person's face goes still when they are trying very hard not to say something they cannot take back. She asked if she could see the paperwork. I told her I didn't have copies, that Gregory kept everything organized in his home office, that I trusted him completely. She asked gently whether I'd noticed that Barbara hadn't been by lately, whether I found that strange. I told her Barbara was probably just busy, that we'd exchanged a few texts, though even as I said it, I realized I could not remember the last time Barbara and I had spoken on the actual telephone, the way we always used to, twice a week without fail for 40 years. Patty left that day quieter than she'd arrived, and I remember feeling a flicker of the old resentment, the sense that Patty had always looked for reasons to doubt her brother, and I chose, in that moment, to defend Gregory rather than to listen to my daughter. I told her, a little sharply, that not everyone who loves you is trying to trick you, and I watched something close in her expression before she gathered Mason's shoes by the door and said goodbye earlier than planned. I think about that afternoon more than almost any other from that year because it was the moment I could have chosen differently, and I did not. Over the following weeks, small things kept happening that I filed away individually without ever adding them together. Vanessa began managing the grocery list that fed all of us, and my particular preferences, the brand of tea I liked, the specific oatmeal Walter and I had eaten every morning for 30 years, quietly disappeared from the pantry, replaced by whatever was more convenient for her own shopping trips. When I mentioned it once, lightly, over breakfast, she smiled and said she simply hadn't realized it mattered so much to me, that she'd add it back to the list, though it never actually reappeared. I began to notice that my mail, which used to come directly to a small box beside my suite's door, had somehow been rerouted so that everything, including anything from the bank, arrived first in the main house mailbox and was sorted by Vanessa before I ever saw it. When I asked about a particular statement I was expecting, she told me she'd already handled it, that there was no need for me to worry myself with numbers when Gregory managed all of that so capably. So I want to be honest about something here, because I think it is important for anyone listening who might be watching an aging parent slowly lose their footing in their own life without any single dramatic moment to point to. Every one of these things, taken alone, sounded reasonable. Every one of them came wrapped in language about care, about ease, about not wanting to burden me. It is only when you step back, the way I eventually had to, and lay every small kindness beside every other small kindness, that you begin to see the shape of a cage being built one polite gesture at a time. The dinner parties changed too, in ways I only fully understood much later. Vanessa began hosting more often, gatherings with her own friends from the neighborhood, women with tennis bracelets and opinions about school districts, and at these dinners, she developed a habit of telling small stories about me, always delivered with a laugh, always framed as endearing, but always designed, I now believe, to plant a particular impression in the minds of anyone listening. She would mention, unprompted, that I'd left the stove on the week before, which had happened exactly once, for perhaps 4 minutes, the way it happens to any busy household occasionally. She would mention that I'd gotten turned around walking back from the mailbox one evening, when in truth I had simply paused to admire a neighbor's new landscaping and lost track of the time for a few minutes on a pleasant evening. Each story, alone, was nothing. Together, repeated at enough dinners to enough guests, they became a narrative, and I did not realize until much later that a narrative was exactly what was being built. carefully, the way a lawyer builds a case, before ever stepping into a courtroom. The night everything changed for me was, as I told you at the beginning, 3 days before my 63rd birthday. I had gone to bed early with a headache, having spent the afternoon helping Sophie with a school project about the water cycle, and I woke sometime after 10 to the sound of voices in the kitchen, Gregory and Vanessa, their voices low but not quite low enough, carried through the shared wall of my little suite, the way sound travels in a house that was, despite all its polish, built quickly and cheaply by contractors who cut corners the family never bother.